Thanks so much, Deborah. It's lovely to be welcomed in such a way, and it's great to see so many people here tonight to look into this really quite interesting question. I don't know about you, I suspect you do too, but I've been thinking about where the future of employment is going. We see a lot of news stories, we hear a lot about how robots and artificial intelligence is changing the face of employment. There was one news item I saw recently that said, I think it was in the Financial Review, that in Australia about 500,000 jobs are likely to be automated within 20 years. An Oxford University study in 2014 concluded that upwards of 50% of jobs in the US will be automated in a similar time frame. Now, I'm not trying to be alarmist here, I'm simply saying what some people are predicting. I'm going to ease it back because just because a job could be automated doesn't mean it's going to be. That's the really good news for a whole range of reasons: cultural, practical, financial, economic, political. Some jobs will remain done by humans. Now, if you think about going to the doctor, you're going to want to be talking to a real live human being, someone who can empathise with you. And we are many, many years away from artificial intelligence that can do that. But also accountants and teachers and a whole range of professions and occupations that involve human contact. It's going to be politically more, well, and socially more acceptable to keep people in those jobs. So I want to emphasise that. Just because something can be automated doesn't mean it will be. But if you were to ask me, well, could my job be automated? Well, the answer is that if it can be described as a process, then theoretically it could be, but subject to those conditions that I was just mentioning. So tonight I'm going to go through a range of topics. Let me just get myself sorted out here. A range of topics around this whole area. It's going to be practical in its focus. I want to get to grips with basically what the threat is, if there is a threat, but also what mindset, what personality factors do you need to have, or do people you know, like your kids, need to have in order to be in demand in the job market, both now and in the future. So I'll be focusing down on that. The image behind me depicts a future that some will find intriguing and optimistic, others will find a bit disturbing. And this is a quirk of human nature, folks. In any human population, there will be roughly one half who embrace change and the other half who are scared of it. And we see that in the way people vote, in the political sense. It often comes down to a knife-edge 50-50, if you can think of elections in recent history where, you know, one party has only just made it. And openness to change and acceptance of change is a personality factor that is probably the most important one for coping with the future of employment. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But it's interesting, in the way that technology is transitioned into society, you will always have a period where there's intense debate about whether it is a good thing or a bad thing. Believe it or not, 100+ years ago, people were sure that the telephone was going to be the end of civilization as you knew it, because, goodness me, someone could just phone you up at home or at your office, and you know that was just not right that people be able to do that. And there was quite quite a bit of discussion, quite a bit of argument. And, but eventually people figured out how to use this new technology, and the people who were worried about being disturbed realised they could just have someone answer the phone for them and screen their calls. Roll forward a bit with TV, and again, there were those who were absolutely sure that it was going to be the end of the world as we know it. I could list out a lot of instances. So any new technology is going to create resistance among some people, and fear, and quite a bit of fear-mongering. And the way to actually cut through this, I have found, is to step back and listen to the spectrum of debate, of opinion, and then work out where the middle ground is between the two extremes that you're hearing. And it might take the rest of society years to get there, but you can arrive there much quicker at the place where society will eventually arrive, somewhere in the middle. So the technology is neither good nor bad, it's simply the way that it is, you know, the use to which it is put. So what are these thinking skills that I was talking about? Well, one of my great, well, I admire his work very much, is the psychologist Howard Gardner. He's a professor of psychology at Harvard. He's written quite a lot of, quite a few books, very influential in the field. And one of his recent books is called 5 Minds for the Future. And in it, he describes 5 fairly generic mindset characteristics that he believes, and I think with good reason, will be useful and in demand in the future. Now I'm going to summarise for you. I'll give you the essence. And the essence is really what the first characteristic is about. He says, people who have the capacity to focus their attention really, really tightly on something, drill down to the essence of that thing, whatever it is, and see what it really is beneath the surface. It's not a new idea. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, said this too. He said, ask yourself, what is this thing? What is it in itself? What is it for? You know, we are inclined, I think, many people, to just look at the superficial appearances of things. So the first mindset is to be able to drill down and see something for what it really is. And if you think about it, in the world today, we have so many distractions and so much information coming at us all over the place. We have something called attention deficit hyper, you know, we're just dazzled by so much. If you can cut through that and get down to the core, then that's the first. The second thing is to be able to do that with multiple things and then look for unusual and look for ways that these things can be combined in ways that they've never been combined before. The creative process is all about seeing those sorts of possibilities that have not been thought of. Now, we all have this capacity, so if you don't think you're a particularly creative person, let me beg to differ. You are potentially a creative person. I know this because children are essentially creative. Been experiments done. Your average child might see 15 different uses for something, but by the time a person's in their 20s and 30s, it's down to half a dozen uses. Person in their 40s, it's down to 3 or 4 things. We get used to orthodox ways of thinking, and it becomes a straitjacket. So that's the second thing, being able to assemble ideas into novel combinations. The third thing is to have basically a fairly tolerant win-win orientation to the world. Now, we humans are fundamentally tribal, clannish. we believe in us and them. I'm not talking about you specifically, but our, people generally. And you only have to look at how popular sport is to see just how much this is the case. We are conditioned to see the world in terms of us and them. But that's not productive anymore, really, because it leads to a lot of conflict. Very little good comes of it. Let's be honest about it. And in this hyper-connected world that we are living in now, and it's only going to become more connected, we are, in fact, global citizens. We are connected, potentially, to everybody else in the world. So a mind shift, if it can be done, is very productive. And that mind shift is to expand out your circle of, let's call it circle of care, what the philosopher Peter Singer called circle of care, basically the people you care about, from your immediate circle, your friends and family, out to the community, further out in concentric rings until you basically encompass the entire world. Now look, I know that that's fairly idealistic, but he's onto something very good there, I think. Essentially, if you see everybody as being a member of the one big human family, then you're less likely to go to war against them or to harm them. You're more likely to want to cooperate. And that's what Howard Gardner sees as being the third really useful, important thing. Another is an extension of this connected principle, and that is to take a big picture view. See the world as a single interconnected entity. This is big thinking. People have to stretch their minds a little bit to get their head around what's going on in the world in its entirety. Yes, but it can be done, and it's a good thing to do because it creates the fourth mindset characteristic that Gardner says is very good. And the fifth thing, subject close to my heart, I teach applied ethics to IT students, and ethics, or an ethical outlook, is really the important fifth thing that Gardner says. Now that's not just do-gooder thinking for its own sake. That's to realise that to do no harm, to actually have an attitude of a constructive, helpful, do no harm attitude is really compatible with those other four things that I talked about. Now I reckon Gardner has got it very well nailed there. I think he's boiled it down to the 5 essential things. He's taken his own advice, he's drilled it down to the 5 most important things. Oops, beg your pardon. So, let me just say a few words now about this whole business of, well, what jobs are going to be done? Okay, well, look, I guess the bad news is that quite a few process-type jobs, factory jobs, telephone operators, postal workers, agricultural workers, people like that are going to increasingly find their jobs being, well, disappearing. So there'll be that, but there'll also be people in occupations that are either dangerous or unpleasant, or for whatever reason is not something that humans would want to do. They will also be a big category of what will be automated. Just bear in mind that in a democratic nation, governments cannot afford to do things that are grossly unpopular. So that's going to be the acid test, is people are going to continue to be looked after by governments. Governments know that they have to look after people, otherwise they won't stay in power. So the possibility of large-scale job loss replace it is very, very unlikely for those reasons. I will talk about what jobs are going to be in demand shortly. We'll come to that. So let me just now continue on with the mastering the new media. This is a very good skill. This is in addition to Gardner's stuff. This is a skill that people anywhere and everywhere, by the way, this is cross-cultural. This is not just here or in the developed world. These really apply everywhere. The new media. There are all sorts of technological tools coming along that make all sorts of things possible. If you know how to use them, you're obviously going to have a real advantage. You've all heard of the Italian Renaissance. If you ever wondered why the Italian Renaissance was so phenomenally progressive and productive, both in an artistic and scientific sense, well, it does help if city-states sponsor, you know, the Duke of Milan sponsoring and the Medicis and so on. Yes, that helps. But what they did was developed really good ways of representing ideas, making prototypes. Galileo, Da Vinci, others created they externalized their thinking so that they could look at it, so that other people could look at it and comment. It became what we would now call a prototype. And in the IT world, many of you will be in the IT world, you will know that in the development sense, prototyping is still the best way to go. But these new media are simply extensions of those Renaissance tools that allowed them to be so successful. So we mustn't underestimate the capabilities of those new media. And of course, communication will always be in demand. It's unlikely that we'll all find ourselves alone in our cubicle, not talking to another physical human being. We humans are far too sociable for that. Even introverted IT workers still like to have a bit of a chat to other people. And incidentally, you know, in the IT industry, it's the ones who can communicate are the ones that do the best. I hammer this point to my communication students at Griffith. Astonishingly, many of them need convincing that they need to study communications. They're a bit reluctant to actually do the course because they just want to program. But essentially, being able to communicate is always going to be in demand. Now, infoglut is a bit of a cliche these days, isn't it? We all know that we're being bombarded by massive amounts of information, and it's getting more. It's a deluge. There's an old saying that we deal with more information in one day than our grandparents dealt with in you know, a lifetime or a long time. Yes, well, that's true. And the people who can develop effective filters that allow them to filter out what is not relevant to them and be cognizant of what is. And that's the second part of this, which is ways of managing the cognitive load, what psychologists call cognitive load. So we actually have to do more thinking in this new world of ours if we're going to stay up with everything that's going on. But the good news is that there are plenty of ways, both technological and psychological, that you can use to manage that cognitive load. So for example, one thing that Google is doing is creating a software agent, an artificial intelligence software program that will be your personal assistant. Now, it's been learning about you for years if you've been using Gmail and Calendar and doing web searches. Some people find this a bit sinister. See, this is that half and half thing again. It's polarized into the people who like it and don't like it. But essentially, I think Google is benign. And what they're trying to do is create an artificial intelligence that is your PA. So if it's your partner's birthday next week, it'll say, it's their birthday, do you want me to book your favourite restaurant? Do you want me to send flowers? Do you want me... it knows you. It knows you as well as any good PA will know your wishes and your preferences. So that's just one example. I'm not spruiking Google. Others will be doing this as well. It's simply an example of ways of managing that cognitive load. Coping with big data. That's one thing that we do quite well in our school. Michael Blumenstein, our head of school, and Bella Stantic, others, big on this whole big data, managing it, doing things with it. Fascinating area, and it's going to be something that is going to be huge. That's one of those jobs of the future, being a data analyst. Something else. Collaboration tools, virtual reality tools. It's fantastic the way we now have video conferencing, richly textured, high-definition videocon capability that allows us to collaborate with people anywhere in the world, broadband enabled. In our school, we do this between multi-campuses. We go into a suite on the Gold Coast. We have a meeting, a school meeting, because we're across 3 campuses in 3 different places, and it all works really well. But what it does, it allows you to work on projects that take advantage of getting the right people for the job, for the right money too, because they can be living anywhere in the world, and the right people with the right skills at the right price can be working on projects. And this facilitates doing things that weren't previously possible. And so those those virtual reality technologies are, I believe, going to become very important. An extension of that is this idea of jobs in cyberspace, or jobs servicing the needs of cyberspace. So there's something called a procedural architect. Maybe you've never heard of that, but essentially that's somebody skilled in the whole user experience field. Now, if you think of the really big name players like Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, LinkedIn, you know, the big names, Twitter, the way you interact with those sites is extremely carefully orchestrated. There are people being paid a lot of money, teams of people, creating an experience for the user that they find pleasant and conducive to the achievement of the aims of that particular website. There's a lot of psychology involved. It's one of those areas in the IT world that is not terribly technical. It's more psychological and anthropological. So people who know how to create nice online experiences are going to be in big demand. They already are, and that's going to continue to be the case. Now, I did promise to tell you what jobs are going to be in demand. Won't keep you waiting any longer. I've got a list here. I'll read it out to you, but I'll preface it by saying employment agencies love to create lists. It's their business. And this list is a consolidation of half a dozen that I saw. So in the IT world, we've got security analysts. Now, cybersecurity is huge nowadays. There are significant threats, people trying to breach security. And that applies to almost every organisation you could imagine. So people who can handle cybersecurity. Big data analysts, which is something I was just mentioning. AI, or artificial intelligence and robotics people. Applications developers of all kinds, including mobile applications. Web developers, database administrators, business intelligence analysts, gamification designers. What you might ask is that? Well, that's building in the little rewards into things that people do so that they are motivated to continue. I build it into my course by having 10 short quizzes each week, 2% each. If someone misses one, it's no great disaster, but it's 2%, and people do it every week, and they get a little sense of, yeah, you know, I did that, I'm going to level up. I don't use that language when I'm talking to them about it, but essentially it's rewarding people for doing what you want them to do. And lastly, people like myself, ethicists, who can basically advise on the social impact of what it is people are doing. And incidentally, if I can boil it down into two principles, ethical IT practice is all about getting people's informed consent before they use the technology so that there are no unpleasant surprises. They know what is going to happen to them when they use it. Their details are not going to be used improperly. That's the first thing. And the second is that they should not be harmed by the use of it. Another way of saying should not be dehumanised or made to suffer or in any kind of way. Even if the person doesn't mind, it's still not really ethical to do it, because really what you do to other people you ultimately do to yourself. So that's in the IT world. In the non-IT world, more broadly, we're going to see big demand for people like accountants, people like lawyers. We live in a very numbers-driven business environment, an increasingly complex legal environment. Financial advisors, project managers, doctors of all kinds, medical personnel of all kinds, specialist doctors, nurses, pharmacists, psychologists, yes, health services managers, even veterinarians, because more people are living alone and they have pets that they adore and that they would want to keep alive at any cost. School teachers, market research analysts, sales reps, construction workers, particularly bricklayers and carpenters. Bricklayers. Now that's one of the threats that I was going to get onto about people's jobs being taken, because 3D printing is a technology that is set to be nothing short of a new industrial revolution. There isn't much that can't be made by 3D printing. I'm personally sceptical that you could make anything terribly complicated with a 3D printer, and indeed at the moment you can't with what you can buy from Harvey Norman or Kogan, but there are prototypes. The team at Monash have just printed out 2 working jet engines. Essentially, there isn't much that can't be made. And in China, they're printing out houses, in fact, whole apartment buildings, using recycled materials. But you see, that's the thing. You could say, well, that's going to be the end of the building industry. Well, no, because, you know, it's going to be expensive to acquire that sort of technology, and people are still going to want their houses built out of brick for, you know, for a long time to come. So those are just some of the occupations that are going to be, or will remain, in demand. So before I proceed to the next part, let me just say a few words about, well, what can be done about this? You know, not too long ago, the federal government was saying that they would really like it if people at retirement age would stay in employment if they feel like it. You know, Social Security is expensive, and the pension is costing the country a lot of money. Government would like to reduce they say it's simply not sustainable to keep paying people. People are living longer. Now that's as may be. I'm not getting into a political argument about that. That may well be the case. So they want to reduce that tax burden by encouraging people to stay in jobs for longer. But given that 500,000 jobs are likely to go, according to the Fin Review, in the not too distant future, well, that's going to put pressure on older people from even finding a job or staying in their job and not being pushed out the door. And add to that the fact that youth unemployment is something like 4.5 times the national average, that keeping older people in employment longer is hardly going to do anything constructive for youth unemployment. This is a doozy of a problem. It's so complex that you could call it a wicked problem. Believe it or not, there is a category of problem called a wicked problem, and this would certainly qualify. I really don't know what governments everywhere are going to do about this. There will need to be some kind of restructuring of economies in order for this problem to be solved, because the way things currently are, I don't see solutions. And it really is not rational to just hope for the best and say, well, you know, it's probably going to work out okay in the end. All of those things that I've just mentioned, youth unemployment, older people staying in work longer, 3D printing, robots taking over jobs, it really does say that. So what's the solution? Well, I don't actually think there is any one simple solution to this. There needs to be policy initiatives. Governments need to basically train people with the skills that they need to do actual jobs, jobs that are currently needed. And that's what we do at Griffith. We listen very carefully to our industry advisors, and we try and stay right up there at the head of the curve so that we're giving, you know, the IT industry what they want. But there's more that could be done. More funding to the university sector would be a good start. But there are other ways that this could be managed, and that is something called open data. Don't know if you've heard of it, you probably have. It's been something of a quiet revolution, open data. It really goes back to the work of Tim Berners-Lee, who you will know as the inventor of the World Wide Web. Berners-Lee is just one of quite a few strong advocates, and it's really basically saying to governments, look, you're sitting on massive data sets that you have collected as part of what you do. You're doing what you're supposed to do. Time to unlock that data, those silos of data, and make it available to whoever in the world wants to use it. Now that sounds pretty scary and dangerous when you say it like that, but of course before it gets released it's sanitized, its privacy issues are addressed. It's not possible to identify individuals, it's really just the anonymous data. Now there are loads of success stories of new businesses who have started to make good use of that open data, both here in Australia and elsewhere in the world, to create new businesses, to create wealth. Now, Australia is no laggard here. We are up there with the best in the world. The US and the UK are probably the two leading countries in the world for this. But I'll just give you a very short instance or example of how this will work. And bear in mind that the McKinsey Consulting Group estimates that there is between 2 and 3 trillion US dollars of value locked up in open data that could be unlocked if people were to devise creative ways of unlocking it. And that's one way that we might address this problem that I have been outlining. Open data and businesses growing up around it. So the example, just very quickly. In the US, a company called the Climate Corporation, which was recently acquired by Monsanto for more than $1 billion, I do believe. Now they were only 4 or 5 years, I think, in existence at that time. And they did that by using data made available by the US Meteorological or US Weather Service, whatever they call it, to build a business. So what they did, they basically took that data and they created a probability chart for farmers in various areas to say, okay, well, you've got an 80% chance of getting the rain you need. We'll sell you some insurance for the 20% risk. And they got better at it. They realised that the amount of rain wasn't the only thing. It was how much of that rain actually soaked into the ground. So they then took a data set from a different government department about soil types, integrated all that together. They invested in more weather stations, and essentially they said to people, farmers, we will increase your profitability by, I think, 25%. It was something in that order, and they made that guarantee. And it works. It works fantastically well because farmers have figured out how to solve pretty much all of the other problems. Pests, fertiliser, you know, it's a known thing. The only thing they can't control is the weather, and this is the one final thing. So $500 billion a year is how much the agricultural sector in the, sorry, 500 million. No, that doesn't sound enough. Anyway, it's 500 something, but essentially it's worth a lot to increase that profitability. Monsanto, the big agribusiness, saw, well, that could fit into our portfolio of businesses. We will pay that amount for it. So, you know, the creativity is the possibility for this to be done is really quite phenomenal. Okay, so that's open data. Also, there is a lot of regional communities in Australia that have a lot of potential. They have a unique thing going for them in the area where they're at. And with broadband internet coverage and other things like that, they should be able to build up a business which will keep jobs in their local area. So it's the think globally but act locally. Now, some of those businesses could be open data. You know, there's a whole range of businesses. It doesn't matter where you do them from. You can do them from wherever. I've been working with, well, talking with some people at Curtin University in WA, the city of Albany, right down on the southern coast there, is looking to establish an innovation precinct, and essentially they are looking to do something like that there, and that same sort of thing could be done really in any sizable town in Australia. Lots of possibilities there. Okay, so drawing towards the end, I want to now just essentially run through or reiterate what the personality sort of traits and characteristics that people who will succeed in the future will have. And I think this is the crux of it. As jobs go, new jobs will be created. Most of those jobs, we don't even know what they're going to be yet. You know, some quite large proportion of jobs in 10 years have not even been dreamt of yet. So we don't really know, but they will be created. We know that they will. So there's opportunity there. And the people who will be best placed to take advantage of that are the ones who, as I mentioned before, are able to drill down and see the essence of something, but also to be able to think, to liberate their thinking from orthodoxy. Now, that word orthodoxy means what is held to be right. And this is a real tendency that humans have, particularly the older we get, the more orthodox in our way of thinking we become. It's got a lot to do with being social creatures. We want to fit in, we want to be accepted, we want to be validated by the people in our lives. It means accepting group norms. It means adopting a certain kind of groupthink. This is the right way to think. And when you start thinking like that, it's basically anything new that comes along is dismissed, because in an orthodoxy, it's basically saying, well, the matter is settled. We know what the right thing is. We don't need to think about it any further. We can just stay with that. Now, the people who will prosper are the ones who recognise that trap and avoid it. In the IT industry, in every industry, essentially, it's the people who can remain open-minded and adaptable to what comes along, to what is happening. That's the second thing. It is to basically step back and get perspective. That's another of those Gardner things, be able to get a global perspective. You step back and you look at the patterns of development around you. You look at the way things are going. Patterns of development historically don't really vary that much. Humans, when they interact with each other, do so in fairly predictable ways. So the patterns of history do repeat themselves, as per George Santayana's famous saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So you can learn from history. You can see the patterns of development, like, for example, virtual reality. I'm suggesting to you that that's a technology that is coming because of what I've seen. And if you can then extrapolate that, pardon me, if you can extrapolate that, to use a mathematical term, into the future, using that same pattern, then you'll be able to predict in a broad sense where things are going. I'm not talking about details, I'm talking about broad trends here, and they are predictable. And if you look at the work of people like Ray Kurzweil, he's done some very accurate work on this, because he bases his predictions on quantitative data. He's very good. So, but anyone can do this. You can step back and see where things are heading, so that when the future arrives in 5 or 10 years, you've positioned yourself to take advantage of it when it arrives. You've proactively positioned yourself. You haven't waited for the future to arrive and then reacted to it. You're proactive, not reactive. And any and all of us can do that. So that's the second thing. Third, remain curious, open-minded. It's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we already know everything there is to know about, well, what it is we do. You know, our little specialty, and you know, curiosity for what goes on outside of there. Highly creative people are intensely curious about everything. Things that have no conceivable use, they're still interested in it. Now, you're either, you know, people are intrinsically that way, or you can cultivate a curiosity, at least to the point of taking an interest in things that aren't central to your interests. An extension of that orthodoxy thing is the fixed ideas way of thinking. Because there have been ways that things have been done in the past that you might have learned at university, you might have learned in the workplace, the tendency is always to just repeat that and extend on it into the future. It was right once, it's right now. That's the sort of rationale. But of course, the social environment evolves. What was once the best way of doing something is not necessarily the best way of doing it now. Circumstances have changed. The social environment has changed. So It's really reacting to the situation as it currently is and coming up with the best solution to that problem that exists without necessarily much reference to the historical way of doing something. So the ethical perspective is another thing. Essentially, doing no harm, not causing people any problems as you by your actions. And resilience. You know, there's a real tendency, if someone gets thwarted a few times, they tend to rationalise that fate, the universe, the gods, some external agency simply doesn't want you to succeed at that, and that's then taken as, you know, a good reason not to persist. But every successful, creative person, every inventor you can think of, people like Thomas Edison, they failed so many times that, you know, you would need superhuman resilience to cope with that, but they did. But they don't think of it as failure. They simply saw it as, you know, one step closer to a solution. So resilience, easier said than done. Look, I know, it's hard, but it is an essential skill. So those are some of the characteristics, and I hopefully have managed to convey that essentially those characteristics that have always been the strong point of humans in the past, now, will remain so in the future. So essentially that's pretty good news, essentially, but the employment landscape is going to change a bit. But if you remain open to those changes, then there is no reason at all why you cannot adapt and prosper, particularly when there will be so many people who don't proactively approach it, who simply wait for it to change and then probably complain bitterly about how the world is no good anymore. You know, it's accepting reality, basically, and dealing with reality. So in closing, I would just like to quote the X Prize founder, Peter Diamandis. X Prize is this foundation established in America with 7-figure prizes for people who come up with solutions to grand challenges. And Diamandis basically points out that at no point in human history have we had exponential technology that connects us all, potentially, is connecting billions of minds and more coming online all the time in the developing world. Billions of people working together in a connected way to solve. Humans have solved bigger problems than this. We're a very resilient species. We're more than up to dealing with something of this kind. So those are the people who will lead us into the future, and hopefully you will be among them. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You've set out a very interesting and challenging path for people's work aspirations, the way to deal with those and tackle them in the future. I'm sure there's some really fascinating questions and conversations that we'd like to have. So please, over to you.
Yes.
I've worked in industrial automation for quite a while.
All right.
I've seen over the last few years companies, we used to do robotic automation installations with a 3-year payback. Now they're looking for a 1-year payback, more competitive.
Yeah.
So, you know, a single project, you could do 20 people out of the job for $300,000. So the production workers are how a business leaks money back into the community. So as technology increases, we're plugging all these business So all the resources are getting pulled out of the community and nothing's going back in.
Yep.
So how do you see in the future, as it accelerates, how do we stop our communities from collapsing?
That is the really, yes, I know what you're saying. That is the really big question. That's part of that wicked problem that I don't think there's a simple solution. And just to add to what you were saying, you know, we've seen the car industry in Australia close, and you know, so Holden are now sourcing their cars from Korea, where the proportion of industrial robots is very high. There's quite a high proportion of the workforce in Korea is robotic. So instead of Commodores being made here, we're getting Daewoo sourced cars being rebadged and shipped out here. And what about all those workers that no longer have a job? And I think that sort of phenomenon is occurring in other industry sectors as well. So it's a very good point and one well taken. Look, the sad fact of the matter is that a lot of that job category is going to disappear, but as the new production methods come in, new jobs will be created around servicing and supplying and all of those aspects, servicing the robotics industry. So it's not just people coming out and servicing the robots, it's installing them, it's everything that involves. Now I know that you probably, I would say that for every one job like that created, there might be 20 jobs on the production line lost. And if they're a 50-year-old worker who's not inclined to reskill, then chances are they're probably not going to work again, and will be, or you know, that's a big problem that we face. So I'm sorry, I don't have a solution, but in a net sense, economies can compensate for job losses in some sectors for job gains in others. Yes?
Just following on from that, and to answer the gentleman's question, I'm thinking that there's going to be, as you've alluded to, this whole new job sort of arenas arising, and I've read some of Faith Popcorn, and like she talks about whole new things where there's things like cocooning, people want to stay indoors more, people want to have services done for them more. So there's all the, and right. As you said, there'll be a whole bunch of new jobs in 10 years that didn't even know exist.
Yes.
So I don't think it's such a bleak outlook.
Yes, that's right. Cocooning is a social phenomenon that, if you're not familiar, it's the tendency that people have to stay home, not go out, get all their needs met by phoning or going online and getting it delivered. Groceries, food, you know, everything. And so yes, some would say that's going to create other problems, that people are going to become socially isolated. And that's certainly a challenge. It's not going to be easy, but no, there are going to be interesting and unforeseen new opportunities coming along for creative people, people who are prepared to think in sort of new, creative ways about how to solve problems.
David, I think that leads me into a question that I've been pondering. This world that's changing so rapidly, clearly the way that we educate young people now is probably not going to equip them for what they need in the future. What do you think we should be doing differently through all levels of education to prepare people to have the 5 thinking skills, for example, that you exemplified? How would you change the education system? Yes,
thanks. I'm glad you asked that. I am doing my bit with my courses. Essentially, I think there are, well, what I've been talking about tonight, the ability to think creatively in innovative ways. It's a learnable skill, and it can be rolled into ethics as well. And essentially, I know that Stephen Swartz at Macquarie some years ago instituted a university-wide first-year course, basically, that was essentially ethics. And it tried to instill this very thing Now, I'm not sure how it's gone, but I remember hearing about it and thinking, I actually thought that I might try and suggest doing something like that at Griffith. But essentially, that would equip, regardless of what field, what faculty it is, it's essentially giving people a set of metacognitive skills beyond their professional skills to think about the world in ways that, you know, will help them to proactively position themselves and be you know, contributors to the world to come. You know, I think one of the big problems is that people get too sort of focused on their narrow professional interests and don't think in the larger sense. And I would suggest teaching people how to think in that larger sense. Yes. Yes.
I've got a question about medicine, because you talked about that not really being that affected, but I think it'll be affected in part through the leverage effect. So essentially, all the automated scanning and testing and all that sort of stuff can happen before you get to the doctor, possibly through your phone. By the time you actually get to talk to them, it's a much shorter consultation.
Yeah.
So that one doctor is actually treating many more people.
Yep.
And the same effect in hospitals as well, right, with things that can sustain life much more effectively and monitor and maintain.
Yes.
Again, one doctor can see many more people.
Yes.
So I think there'll be some of those effects as well as complete utter replacement.
Absolutely. The medical field is going to become very technology intensive. It already is, and will become more so. I was really just suggesting that when a patient sits down with a doctor, they're going to still want to talk to a human, but behind the human will be all of this technology that simplifies. You know, it can be as simple as test results that stayed in a silo over somewhere else, you know, could be brought in, and there's all this information. You know, in smartphones these days, there is the capability for all sorts of health informatics to be gathered. I think we're going to see an enormous amount of progress happening in that area. Yeah. Yes, up the back.
So the things I've read, and maybe not be true, you might be able to help. We seem to be working longer hours these days than we have in the past.
Yep.
It's a trend upwards, and we're being asked to work longer in our lives. So
yeah.
I reckon by the time I'm ready to retire, I'll be about 90. Retirement age.
Right.
I guess my question is there ever going to be a point, or can you foresee something where not working is acceptable and not have, you know, more of these jobs are being automated, machines are going to get more advanced at a rapid rate.
Yep.
The daily tasks that we do, the things that we do and that people do currently will be replaced by machines.
Yeah.
To say that it's okay not to have a job.
Yeah, I think so, actually, and I'll say why. Well, firstly, I think there's a real blurring of our roles these days. It used to be, not too long ago, that work was work, home life was home life, etc., etc. Nowadays, because we're connected, you know, people famously taking their phones into the shower because they can't bear to be away from it that long. You know, people are checking their email at 3 a.m, etc. So, I mean, that I think counts as work, and work-life balance is an important life skill that many people have a bit of difficulty mastering. You know, the technology itself is not bad, but it allows that person to get a little bit out of balance and annoy people. You know, it's the equivalent of somebody talking loudly on a phone in a restaurant. Famously, somebody at a funeral, their phone rang and he said in a loud voice, "I'm sorry, I can't talk, I'm in a meeting right now." And, you know, it's a trivial example, but you're right, there is that pressure to be always on top of your work. But, you know, in Europe, in France and Germany, there are more companies who are mandating that you shall not look at your work email outside of, you know, it's a rule that you don't do it. Not, oh, you don't have to, but don't do it. The other thing I was going to say was that I think a lot of jobs are going to become more outcomes-based. So you will be given a certain amount of work to do in a certain time frame, to a certain quality, for a certain amount of money, and they don't mind, the client, how or when you deliver it. So if you work best at 3 a.m, you can do it then, and you can, with a clear conscience, take the next day off, and it's socially acceptable. Well, acceptable to your employer and acceptable to you. Maybe not to some other people around you, but essentially. So I think it's going to move in a more outcomes-based and less of the show up at work from 9 to 5 and go home. We all know that a lot of people who turn up for work don't do a whole lot of work whilst they're there. You know, they might be there for 8 hours, but they only do 2 or 3 hours work during that time. So, you know, I think many employers are thinking, well, let's just pay them for the 2 or 3 hours and save ourselves on office space by getting them to do it somewhere else.
Very interesting perspective. We've got some refreshments that we'd love to share with you and continue this conversation in a less formal way. But could I, on your behalf, thank David again for a fascinating presentation, some really thought-provoking ideas that you presented to us tonight. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people who want to come up and have a chat with you after. So could you please join me in thanking David?